Hello, and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Mike Friedman, the 113th president of the National Press Club. I'm the former general manager of CBS Radio Network, now journalist in residence at University of Maryland Global Campus, and executive producer of the public broadcasting series The Kalb Report with journalist Marvin Kalb. We're pleased today to welcome New York Times reporter Nikita Stewart to discuss her book, Troop 6000, the Girl Scout troop that began in a shelter and inspired the world. Ms. Stewart, a native of Texas who moved to Bowling Green, Kentucky as a teenager, is a graduate of Western Kentucky University. She worked at the Courier-Journal in Louisville and the Newark Star-Ledger before making her mark as a beat and investigative reporter right here at the Washington Post. She left the Post in January of 2014 to join the New York Times. In a memo to staff announcing her departure, her editors called her a superlative investigator, a congenial colleague, and one of the best beat reporters we've ever seen. In other words, nice, smart, and a first-rate journalist. 3 years into her tenure at the New York Times, where she covers social services, mental health, and poverty, Ms. Stewart wrote a story about a nascent Girl Scout troop that had formed in a Queens, New York motel used as a shelter for homeless families. The story, which appeared on the front page on Easter Sunday, went viral and prompted both donations and celebrity for the troop and its founder. For the next year, Ms. Stewart followed the troop and the shelter families, recording their triumphs and difficulties in the context of the chaos of homelessness and shelter life. Some 70,000 people are living in New York City shelters. 68% of them are families. Of the 23,000 children under the age of 18, about 12,000 are girls. Families on average spend 18 months in a shelter system meant to provide temporary emergency housing. Financial stability often proves elusive. The Girl Scouts say Troop 6000's program helps girls stay connected with the larger community and enables them to seize the same opportunities afforded girls elsewhere in the city. Since Ms. Stewart wrote that first story, the program has expanded to 20 shelters across the city's 5 boroughs. Here to tell us more about her book and Troop 6000 is Nikita Stewart. Nikita, welcome to the National Press Club.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about the underpinnings for the book. How did you first learn about Troop 6000? Talk about your initial engagement with them.
I got an email in 2017 in that February saying there's a troop that has formed in a hotel that's been turned into a shelter in Queens. And I immediately wanted to write the story because at the time I was writing so many stories about the conflict and the controversy over the placement of shelters around the city. And everywhere I went, there was a lot of community unrest, and a lot of people who were experiencing homelessness were upset that they were not wanted in neighborhoods. And so this story just felt like a relief from that reporting that I was doing. And when I got there, of course, I saw just an incredible story of people starting a troop inside a shelter. I mean, when does that ever happen? And then once the story ran and I decided to dig deeper and write this book, I realized that I had met the founder in 2015 when I first took on the beat in late 2015. I went to another shelter nearby called Pam's Place. And it was also a hotel that had been turned into a shelter, but it was for women. And the Girl Scouts were serving them a Thanksgiving lunch. And, at the time I took a few notes. I wasn't going to write a story. I was just, because when you start a beat, you go everywhere. And someone was like, you can get inside a shelter. And I was like, I always want to see the inside of a shelter. So I showed up that afternoon, and I was really surprised to see all of these girls in their uniforms serving the lunch. And I have to admit that I was moved and I was a little teary eyed that day. And I took a few notes, but, you know, never thought that this would, you know, that one, the scouts that I saw that day would, in fact, some of them would become homeless. That never even crossed my mind.
Tell us about Giselle Burgess, the founder of Troop 6000. Love to learn a little bit more about her story.
Yeah. She's a young mother. She became pregnant as a teenager, dropped out of school, and it took her a while to find her way, but she ended up becoming a kind of dental office manager, the person you see when you walk in the door who's telling you about your files and your appointments and whatnot. And she had built a pretty good career out of that, but the hours became a lot for her. She has epilepsy. It was just hard on her. And so she unfortunately ended up having to leave her job. And for a while, she was unemployed. And her medical bills were stacking up. Um, she was behind on her rent. By this time, she had 5 children. And uh, she found some hope in the Girl Scouts, volunteering with the Girl Scouts. And because her daughters had become Girl Scouts. And so she ended up getting a job with the Girl Scouts, which was great, right? And she's like, oh my goodness, I finally am doing something that I love. And then she's evicted. And so here she is with a full-time job, finally doing well, but not well enough to be able to hang on to her home. And so she ended up entering the New York City shelter system. And once she was there, she realized, like, why can't I start a troop in the shelter where I live? And her bosses were already thinking along similar lines. They wanted to help with the issue of homelessness in the city. And so, it was certainly not, no one wants to be homeless, but in this case, if she had not been in that shelter, we might not have a Troop 6000.
Talk about some of the obstacles that Giselle faced in forming this troop and how it came to be.
Well, you have to get through the red tape, right? And you have to get through. Remember that she lived in a hotel that had been turned into a shelter, but it was still a hotel technically. So she had to get through the hotel staff. She had to get through the shelter operator. She had to get through the Department of Homeless Services. And finally, when all of those pieces were all in place, then she could actually form a troop. But then she had to get through to parents who, it's a shelter. And so you don't feel like it's your home. So you're not, knocking on the door next to you, asking for sugar, because you're like, well, this is only temporary. And do I really want to talk to them? And this is awkward for me and my children. And also, I'm talking about borrowing sugar, but inside a hotel, you can't cook. So, parents had a lot more worries than signing up their daughters for Girl Scouts. So that took some doing. And she started with 8 girls, including 3 of her own daughters. And, but it continued to build. They would meet in what they call the breakfast room at the Sleep Inn, which was, I'm sure many people have spent nights in budget hotels. And so, they have the little buffet and you can go and grab and go. And Then there's a little seating area. So this was the room that had the seating area. And it wasn't being used because by that time, the entire hotel was filled with homeless families. There were no regular guests. And so people would pass by the breakfast room and they're like, what's going on in there? Wait, they're Girl Scouts? And she'd put flyers everywhere. And so word of mouth and the troop kept building. And then, you know, they got a lot of money from the city and they expanded to many more shelters.
A friend of mine, Kat Bug, is a troop leader in Washington, D.C., and she indicated that so much of the planning and running of a Girl Scout troop is up to the troop leaders and the volunteers. So the challenge, so you're articulating one challenge, which is getting through the bureaucracy and the barriers of setting up the troop. And then there's the running of the troop. So talk about the resources that they had and that they didn't have in carrying out the responsibilities of a troop leader and in conducting a proper Girl Scout troop.
Right. Well, remember that parents are very busy, um, generally trying to, they also have the pressure of trying to find housing. Like this is temporary. And basically, finding housing after you've become homeless becomes a full-time job. And so, you have parents who had their regular jobs and their jobs finding homes. But luckily, there were two people who just ended up with some time to give to the Girl Scouts inside the hotel. Two parents, David and Corey, and you know, they Giselle, David, and Corey really became a trio that couldn't be stopped, and built Troop 6000, helped to build it into what it is. And the troop also had a lot of help from just people who were in place who understood where they were coming from. So Giselle's boss, Meredith Mascara, who ended up being the chief executive of the Girl Scouts of Greater New York, gave her a great deal of support. Heidi Schmidt, who is now the director of Troop 6000, she happened to work at the Department of Homeless Services. She had been a Girl Scout when she was a kid, and she remembered how it helped her in rural Pennsylvania. And then, of course, there was a council member, Jimmy Van Bramer, who really pushed for the troop to get the support and resources needed. And he had been homeless as a baby, and his family had experienced a lot of financial hardship through the years. So I say all of this and I introduce these people who are in the book because for a troop like this, it really took people who were in power, who understood the hardships and the obstacles that were in place so that they could try to remove some of those obstacles.
We have some questions for you from Taylor Keene and the members of Girl Scout Troop 6560 here in Washington. Taylor is the daughter of a friend and colleague here at the National Press Club, Angela Greiling Keene, who is a former president of the club and now president of the board of directors of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. But these questions come from Taylor Keene and DC Troop 6560. How did these girls overcome communication barriers as access to technology perhaps was limited for them?
Oh, well, at the time in 2017, and even now, the great thing about Troop 6000, and it was actually kind of the mission at the beginning when they were trying to figure out how they were going to operate a troop inside of a shelter. At first, the Department of Homeless Services was like, "Well, can't you meet at a community center nearby?" And we're like, "No, that is the barrier. There is a lack of communication because of technology, etc. We don't want to put the burden on the parents to have to go somewhere for meetings." So they decided the meetings had to be inside the shelters. And so with Troop 6000 in the 20 different shelters, the girls meet in a community room. And so so they don't have that that barrier with technology. Now, that being said, we're in a pandemic now, and the troops are meeting virtually. And so, they're finally getting that off of the ground. I attended a virtual meeting a few weeks ago, and if there are, since there are Girl Scouts out there, you'll know that the closing circle was like this, and they all touched each other's hands. It was very sweet and very beautiful. But that took some time because a lot of the girls did not have their devices yet, because the Department of Education was slow to get them their devices. But now most girls have devices, and these virtual meetings can now continue.
And that speaks to a second question from Taylor Keene and the girls of DC Troop 6560, which was how much of an impact has coronavirus had on the ability of this troop to run and function? And it sounds like they're overcoming the challenges that they're facing, and they're finding creative ways to continue to be together, and they're being very resourceful about it.
Yes, they are. And I'm a reporter, but I also report on what the troop needs, and the troop can always use more donations to make sure that the girls have their devices, etc. So they can keep running smoothly.
It's a perfect place to say where people can offer donations for the troop. So do you know where they would send donations?
Yes, you can go to the Girl Scouts of Greater New York's webpage. I don't know it off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure it's GSGNY. And you can donate specifically to Troop 6000 if you choose to do that.
Okay. Journalists always try to keep from becoming emotionally involved in their stories. It sounds to me like this story has had a deep impact on you. Talk about the role of the journalist, and as we're seeing, I think largely since September 11th in particular in New York, the role of journalist as citizen as well and member of a community. Talk about that in relation to your coverage of Troop 6000 and your writing of the book.
I was just talking about this last night with Giselle Burgess and one of her daughters, Karina. They asked me what was the challenge for me in reporting, and the challenge was that I couldn't help directly. There is a line that you have to draw as a journalist. I wish I had $20 million and I could give everyone homes, right? But I'm a journalist, and I can't do that, and I'm also not a millionaire. So that was the most difficult part. But as a journalist, I have to remember that my advocacy, my being a part of the larger community, my role in society is to use the power of the pen and to use my journalism to have an impact. And for any reporters covering social services, I think that is what you have to, that's the line that you can draw. And that is what you can do, because, my very first story about the troop, it really brought a lot of attention to them, and they were able to grow because of that story. And so I had already had an impact. Now, fortunately, that impact wasn't always good. There were a lot of mixed emotions about, I think, well, one of the chapters is the lifestyles of the poor and famous, right? So, to be celebrated everywhere and to go to fancy dinners and meet all of these celebrities and high-powered people, and then you go home. Well, not even a home. You go to a shelter. And so there were a lot of highs and lows.
So the incongruities are there probably every day.
Yeah.
We have adopted a theme this year for the National Press Club, which is why journalism matters. And we have focused a lot of attention this year to the work of our colleagues on the front lines of covering the coronavirus crisis and the search for truth and reporting accurately and fairly. Yours is a little different story of the same theme, why journalism matters. You talked about the power of the pen. It must be reinforcing and invigorating and fulfilling for you to know that your work is making a difference there.
It is. It's yeah. I'm like, you're not gonna make me cry today. But this has been the most fulfilling story of my career in terms of the impact that I was able to have on so many children, not only here, but across the country. There have been Girl Scout councils who have that have created similar troops. And so I tell people all the time, because in New York, as you were saying at the top of the show, a family stays in shelter more than a year. In other places around the country, your shelter stay can be limited to 3 months, and you're out. And so if you join a Troop 6000 or a similar troop, you might only be in it for 3 months. But when I first started reporting the book, I met so many women who would say, I was a Girl Scout. And they would say it so proudly. And I would say, oh, well, what rank did you make? Oh, I didn't make it past Brownie. But it was still so important to them. And what I love is that Troop 6000 and now similar troops, they can give girls who could not afford to be in a Girl Scout troop, they can give her the right when she becomes a woman to say, I was a Girl Scout. And so, yeah, it just makes me happy every time I think about it.
Let me just remind our viewers and our listeners that we are speaking with New York Times reporter Nikita Stewart about her book, Troop 6000, the Girl Scout troop that began in a shelter and inspired the world. I'll try to veer over to less emotional sides of this for you for the next few questions. Girl Scouting itself is 108 years old. Often older organizations get mired in tradition and they fail to evolve and perhaps lose their relevancy. What did you learn about the Girl Scouts in the course of researching your book that has allowed them to stay relevant for modern girls?
They kept evolving from the very beginning. I was also a contributor to the 1619 Project, and wrote about my great grandfather who was enslaved in Tennessee and then Texas. And I couldn't shake when I was first reporting on the book. It's like, oh wow, Juliette Gordon Lode's family, made their money from enslavement and cotton. They certainly benefited, but she was this incredible woman who just had a view of the world that the Girl Scouts could be for everyone. And so she didn't stop that. She didn't stop the Girl Scouts from evolving into an organization that embraced all girls, regardless of their race, ethnicity, class. And that just continued to the point that during the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. called the organization a force for integration, which, as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh, wow. And, they had a Black president early on. And so uh, they've just been able to keep up with the times. And, but at the same time, they do believe strongly that this is an organization for girls and that is tailored for girls and empowering girls. And so, yes.
You cover social services, mental health, and poverty for the New York Times. Tough subjects. I'm sure that there's a learning curve for you every step of the way on this. As much as you learn, there's more to find out. A lot of people have images of the homeless based on who they see in the streets or outside a metro, say here in Washington, D.C., and that may be their only interaction with a homeless person. From your experience, talk to us a little bit more about the homeless. Who are the homeless? We've heard the one story. Talk to us a little bit more about it.
Well, you talked about your only interaction with a homeless person, but um, I think what so many of us need to understand is that we're likely interacting with people experiencing homelessness more than we think, because you're viewing someone who's homeless as the man with the cardboard sign, when uh, you know a federal definition of homelessness for students, that definition counts children who are living doubled up and tripled up with relatives or strangers. And so there are so many people living in overcrowded situations. Um, and also in the New York City shelter system, the majority of people are families with children. And so they may not look homeless to you, but they are. And you're likely interacting with people every day. And so when I first took on the beat, I really wanted to break the stereotype of people thinking of homelessness only as the people on the street. Now, that doesn't mean that people on the street, that their stories should not be told too, because right now in New York, we, in dealing with the pandemic, we're seeing that single adults who are experiencing homelessness are the most vulnerable people at this time, because they live in dormitory style shelters where they can't escape the virus as easily as others because their beds are close together. They're sharing bathrooms. They're eating in the same uh, cafeterias, auditoriums, and so it's harder for them to protect themselves.
Course of your reporting on this and other stories, what kind of an assessment could you offer about the safety net system for folks who become homeless? What works and what doesn't work? We talked about specific challenges right now during the coronavirus crisis. On a more general basis, what's broken? What needs fixing? And what's out there that's actually helping?
Well, number one is housing that people can actually afford. I heard a question last night. Someone asked me, "Oh, well, what should households know about financial literacy and budgeting to, you know, ensure that they're not homeless or they don't become homeless or whatever?" And I stopped because I was like, well, it's hard to budget when you don't have anything to budget with. And I was like, one of the things that we have to probably consider, and when I say we, I guess I'm talking about me as a member of the community and as a voter, but it's left to our elected officials and policymakers. Um, they have to think about giving people a living wage and controlling affordable housing in a way that makes housing accessible to people. With the rental assistance vouchers, you have to have a voucher that lasts longer than a few months, that doesn't have a bunch of hoops, um, so that people can feel secure in their lives. Just the instability of poverty is what is most troubling to me when I'm reporting.
So let's personalize it again a little bit. We've talked about the founding of Troop 6000. Talk to us a little bit about the girls and some of the stories involving these girls who you got to know and followed along their path.
Well, Giselle's oldest daughter, Haley, um, from the beginning, she really hid her homelessness. She was very embarrassed about their situation, to the point where she lied to her friends at school, to her, remember they came from a traditional troop, to her fellow Girl Scouts in her traditional troop. Um, and so I just watched her evolve from this person who was embarrassed to now being this really advocate for other girls experiencing homelessness. Fortunately, they are now in a home and out of shelter, but she's working on her gold right now. And she is her project deals with Troop 6000 because she obviously knows a lot about it. So I watched her evolve. Uh, there is a young lady also. I call her young lady because she's 18 now. Um, Genesis in the book, and readers can see her evolution from someone who felt like she didn't fit in. She didn't think she fit in at her school. And the Girl Scouts became a place where she could feel safe and secure. And, she helped her fellow scouts in a way that I won't give away. So you can read the book and find out. Um, and so, yeah, just watching them evolve that way. And then the younger ones, they're just so funny, and they've really grown up in front of my eyes. They used to be like, you know much shorter than me, and now some of them are taller than me because it's been 3 years, and I'm like, I can't believe this. Like, when did this happen? And so one of the troop leaders in the book, Corey, she didn't have a daughter. She had a son, but she became a troop leader and was just really instrumental, and still volunteers with a different shelter. And she called all of the Girl Scouts her daughters. And I think I feel the same.
We have a question from a National Press Club member, Audrey Hoffer. As a result of this book and the surrounding publicity, will the girls and or their families derive any real benefits like money, a better place to live, a dedicated academic mentor, guaranteed college, that will help propel them forward in life and society?
Ugh. Well, I certainly hope so. I hope the book will generate enough interest to get that kind of direct help. A lot of the girls, because of Troop 6000, have received mentorship. I do wish there was like some kind of dedicated fund just for Troop 6000 girls, like for uh, scholarships, whatnot. All I can tell you is that there has been a great deal of interest in making that happen, and hopefully it will.
Why do you think the original article went viral? What made people connect with the original story?
I think it's because, and as we were saying earlier, people have an image of homelessness. And then I think it finally hit people like, oh, wait, a Girl Scout can be homeless. Like, you just don't think about it, right? Because you're like, oh, she's the girl outside the supermarket selling her cookies. She's in the uh, 4th of July parade with her troop. You just don't think of uh, a Girl Scout um, being homeless and being without a home. Um, and so I think that's why it resonated with people, because people are just very familiar with Girl Scouts. And now they could connect Girl Scouts and people living unhoused.
It's certainly the hope of every reporter that their stories will resonate with readers. Did it catch you off guard a little bit, watching the intense spotlight and the interest pointed at the troop and its members as a result of that piece?
I kind of knew once I finished writing it. Um, the yeah, there are some editors who are like always just very like straight, like, and once a certain editor said, oh wow, this is really good, I was like, uh-oh, this could be like big. And I remember I reached out to a spokeswoman for the Girl Scouts and said, do you all have anything set up for Troop 6000, like a donation? And because I just knew like I was going to be inundated and I needed to have somewhere to send readers to. And they were like, oh, as a matter of fact, we do. Um, because I had a feeling that it was going to resonate with people. I did not know that they would end up on like The View and Jimmy Fallon and just everywhere. And I wasn't expecting that, and I think they weren't expecting it too, and it became a little much. And readers of the book will learn more about that.
There's a hidden gem in what you just said, and that is for all the reporters that are watching and listening, that it is possible to get a compliment from an editor, right? Somewhere along the way. Before you joined the New York Times, you were here in Washington at the Washington Post. Talk about the homeless population in Washington compared with the population in New York. And I don't want to generalize too much, but are there differences in the way the communities respond to the homeless between Washington and New York? Are there different challenges that they face between the two cities?
I think there are challenges because, well, in New York, uh, there are just more people, and there's a larger homeless population. Um, and New York City has the right to shelter, which means that anyone eligible is supposed to be given shelter. Not every city has that policy. And so, like in New York, I mean, I don't think, as a reporter, I have never seen myself like a family like living in a car, which is what you will see in other places around the country, or a family being forced to go into a budget hotel themselves and pay, because here in New York, it is legally mandated for the city to provide that shelter. So that's the biggest difference I see in population and then in the city's response to the homelessness. And when I was in DC, I did not cover homelessness. And around the country, homelessness has increased since I was there. so many years ago. Can't believe it's been 6, 7 years. That was a long time ago.
As a social services reporter for the New York Times, you've been writing a great deal about the impact of COVID-19 on people who don't have a lot of resources. And you touched on this a little bit earlier. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've learned about how poverty affects people as they weather something as critical as this pandemic?
Um, yeah, I mean, the biggest issue in the beginning, particularly for families, was the lack of technology, the not having access to Wi-Fi, not having the devices for children to learn. That reared its head very early on. So that was uh, an issue for families. And then with single adults, as I was saying, uh, you're dealing with dormitory style shelters where you can't escape the virus. There is a big push here for the city to open more hotel rooms to place people so that they are not in congregate settings. And so those have been the stories that I have followed. Um, I will be having a story sometime soon, hopefully, that looks at the lines now outside of pantries. Um, I wrote a story about pantries maybe 2 years ago, and the lines look very different now in terms of how long they are. Not only because of the number of people, but also because of social distancing and the people who are in the lines. There are people in line now who had never been in a line before and are quite surprised that they're in the line. And so um, those are the stories that I'm dealing with um, in the pandemic.
Let's go back to the Girl Scouts. How do we ensure that organizations such as Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts don't become bastions for the privileged? How do we keep the bar to entry at a level so that everybody can still participate? We have a wonderful example in Troop 6000. They received a lot of support from New York, and so they serve as a good example. Tell us a little bit about what you saw along the way here and what guidance you might offer based on your observations.
Right. Organizations like the Girl Scouts, they need volunteers who are going to be there. Because sometimes people volunteer and they're like, "Oh yeah, I want to go on this camping trip," and we're like, "Yeah, but we also need you to be at the shelter, every, every week, once a week," and you're like, "Oh, okay, that's a big commitment." In terms of money, the Girl Scouts depend on dues, but uh, those dues, uh, the girls experiencing homelessness and in shelter, uh, they can't pay those dues. And so those are subsidized. And luckily, the Girl Scouts have been able to, the Girl Scouts of Greater New York, the organization has been able to raise money and also, received a grant from the city of $1.1 million. And hopefully that will be renewed so they can continue their work. Yeah.
So here are two 30,000-foot questions. What did the Girl Scouts give to these homeless girls, and what did these homeless girls contribute to the Girl Scouts?
Ooh. Um, the Girl Scouts gave them joy. I know that sounds like so simple, um, but you have to remember that at the time, at the sleep in, um, families were just kind of going in and out, not really talking to each other. Some girls went to the same new school, but didn't talk at school and didn't realize they lived in the same shelter because everyone kept to themselves. Um, and so, there weren't any play dates, there weren't any sleepovers. Um, and for a lot of children, those sleepovers and those play dates are like, they'll end up being some of your best childhood memories. And the girls didn't have that. And so the Girl Scouts gave them at least one day a week that time to be together and to just have fun and learn. And what the girls gave to the Girl Scouts, I believe, was this kind of remembering why the organization existed. And there are many more areas where the Girl Scouts have also, been involved in helping girls who are less fortunate or vulnerable from, forming in low income housing developments to, uh, troops that are, may have parents in jail. Um, this is an organization that uh, allows itself to be used in a way to reach as many girls as possible. And I didn't really understand that about the Girl Scouts when I first started reporting the book, but now I do. I wasn't a Girl Scout when I was a kid because my family had to pick and choose what we could afford, and the Girl Scouts, that wasn't one of them. And at the time, no one was subsidizing dues in the 1970s and 80s. Um, and so I didn't have that Girl Scout experience. But now, you know, I can attest through my reporting that it can really have an impact on a girl from just the sisterhood and learning about community. This is not an organization that is political, but it certainly believes in civics. And I even saw the Troop 6000 girls get really involved in like trying to shape policy in Queens. So that was quite exciting to see them get so involved in government that way. So.
And you touched on there some of what the girls contributed. In the broader spectrum, what do you see as the contributions of these girls to Girl Scouts, to all of us who now know the story, and to our country and the world?
Well, it's funny you should say that because there is someone in the book. Her name is Sanai, and I mean, if you ever have the chance to meet her, and you will meet her in the pages of the book, but I mean, I'm just like, she's gonna be the president or the mayor or something. She is going to be in your city wherever she chooses to live. She's like, I don't know, I might move to Atlanta. I'm not sure. But she just really understands policy, and she knows how to use her voice. She knows the questions to ask. Um, I'm just amazed by her. And then she's also like super into coding. I can remember and you'll actually read it in the book. The girls are trying to decide, like, well, what are we going to, what's going to be our badge? What are we going to learn? And she's like, I want to learn coding. And last summer, and fortunately, her family too, they are no longer in shelter. And last summer, she was in a Girl Scouts program for coding at Microsoft, and she was right next door to the New York Times. And so she lives all the way on Staten Island, so I don't get to see her as often. So I was really excited. So it's like I can just pop next door and see you when you come out before you like head to the ferry. So so yeah, so I get very excited talking about them.
Going back to the late 19th century in the 1880s, there was a book that came out. It was a photojournalistic book by a gentleman named Jacob Riis called How the Other Half Lives. And it provided the first photographs that a lot of people saw about poverty, particularly on the Lower East Side of New York, and it led to social change. There was also some controversy attached to it with regard to where do you draw the line between reporting and intrusiveness. How well were you embraced by these folks that you wanted to write about? Was there a challenge up front? Was there some natural skepticism on their part about what you would do with this story?
Yes, there was a natural skepticism. Uh, it took me a while to get through to a few of the families that are in the book. There were some families who just decided, no, I don't want to tell you any more of my story. It's fine to like talk to my daughter, but I don't want to tell you about me. Like, okay. And I respected uh, people's privacy. I respected, um, if they didn't want to participate, I understood. And so luckily, the book ended up focusing on some of the original girls who like their families were finally embraced me and allowed me to share their stories, not just them being at meetings, but really understanding how their families ended up in shelter and and their hopes and dreams for getting out. And so and then also in writing the book, I really wanted to not tell the story through my eyes. Yes, I am the narrator, but I wanted to make sure that anything that I wrote was reflective of how they were really feeling. And so, it's not enough to just say, and she cried. I'm going to say, I have to go to them like, okay, why were you really crying in that moment? Why were you really laughing in that moment? And of course, with the book, and it's forever. And, all the families in the book, I went over every line that dealt with them to make sure that it was not only accurate, but that it reflected how they were really feeling. And in fact, I'll share this. I was talking to Sanai's mother, and she said, "Oh, this was really hard to read." And I was like, "Well, this was before the book was published." And I was like, "Oh," I was like, is this bad?" And she was like, "No, no." She was like, "It was, it was good. It was perfect, but it was hard for her to read, to like relive everything." But I'm happy to say that the parents are, they're very excited about the book, and um, they've only said good things to me so far, so that's great. um, and it was really important to me that they felt that this was accurate and like I said, just got it right.
This is a story about a Girl Scout troop. It's a story about culture. It's a story about society. It's about courage. It's about integrity. It's about perseverance. For those watching and listening who are not journalists, in this world, we look for the nut graph of a story, which tells why, what the heart and meat of the story is. What's the nut graph of this story for you?
Oh no. It took me a year to figure that out. I was talking about this, how I went in really thinking I'm writing this book. It's about homelessness and housing. That's what this book is about. Except I'm telling it through the eyes of Girl Scouts. Like that was like my premise. And I ended up writing a story that was really more about um, the meaning of community and uh, wanting to be a part of something bigger than yourself, wanting to give the most of yourself, even when you have little to nothing. And, there's a pandemic. So a lot of people are like, oh, well, what does this have to do with coronavirus? Well, um, in the pandemic, there's this right now, there's this sense that, we all have to look out for each other. I see you, or you have gloves on. Um, and in this case, the parents and the Girl Scouts, they just really started looking out for each other and caring about the community around them. And so that's what it ended up being about. It ended up being more about community than it was about homelessness and housing.
As we close out the program, two final questions. What are your takeaways from this experience, and do you feel it has changed you?
Oh. It has changed me in terms of like, stop it. Don't get me upset today. But I grew up, my family would go back and forth from we're doing fine to like we don't have enough money. And so I was that kid embarrassed to pick up her free lunch card. So I understood that stigma, and I understood Haley's feelings of being embarrassed. And now I see girls, they wear Troop 6000, like that's a badge of honor. Like, yep, I might not have housing, or I didn't have it before. And so what? I am resilient and I'm a member of Troop 6000. So watching that, watching how the troop has changed attitudes, not only of the public, but of the girls themselves, it's just been beautiful.
Nikita Stewart of the New York Times, as a token of our appreciation, we are going to send you our iconic National Press Club coffee mug, with the hope that we can soon welcome you back in person to Washington and to the National Press Club to share some fresh brew together. And we'll look forward to that day. In the meantime, thank you for joining us, and all the best as you go forward in search of truth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our thanks to our National Press Club production team that made this program possible, and to our Headliners team, co-chairs Donna Leinwan-Leger and Lori Russo, as well as staff liaison Lindsay Underwood, for their invaluable help. To all we say, stay well, stay safe. Please join us in the fight to protect and defend press freedom, and have a good day.